Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Terry Richardson. I serve as the mayor's representative on the board of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, and I'm an assistant commissioner at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Fresh Kills, the inside story of the recovery operation after 9/11. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members and to those tuning in to our live web broadcast. Thank you to all the rescue and recovery workers joining us this evening, and a special thanks to DSNY and the Sanitation Foundation for partnering with the museum to put together today's Community Day and the film screening of An Invisible Act. As many of you may already know, in the aftermath of 9/11, unprecedented rescue, recovery, and relief efforts began at Ground Zero, where 1.8 million tons of debris filled what remained of the World Trade Center. In the subsequent weeks, this work was formalized and carried out by a variety of departments and agencies at both Ground Zero and at Fresh Kills, a recently closed landfill in Staten Island. This work formally ended on May 30th, 2002, to commemorate the 21st anniversary of this milestone and to honor the thousands who have died and become sick due to 9/11 related illness linked to these efforts. We are honored to host tonight's program that takes a closer look at the interagency operations that took place at Fresh Kills. This 2,200-acre landfill was the largest in the world until it received its last barge of waste on March 22nd, 2001. Months later, in the aftermath of 9/11, a 175-acre portion of the site became the primary location to sort through and investigate the World Trade Center wreckage. As you will hear, this wasn't something that had been planned for. There was no how-to guide on how to stand up and run a site like this, and yet it was done. By the time Fresh Kills closed, roughly 1.5 million tons of debris had been transported there by truck and barge from Ground Zero. More than 50,000 personal effects have been recovered. Approximately 1,400 vehicles had been transported for search and disposal. And more than 2,300 human remains were recovered, which have since been matched with more than 700 victims. I want to take a moment to introduce the individuals on the stage joining us tonight to tell the inside story of these operations at Fresh Kills. Richard Marx is a supervisory special agent with the FBI who served as incident co-commander at Fresh Kills landfill. He began his career with the Bureau in 1997 as an agent in the Philadelphia Field Division. During his 25-year career, Marx has worked in various squads and has been involved in support efforts following mass casualty events and disasters around the world. He is currently assigned to the Evidence Response Team Unit at the FBI laboratories at Quantico. Roger Parrino served in the New York City Police Department for over 21 years, where he was promoted to Lieutenant Commander of Detectives. On 9/11, Parrino responded to the World Trade Center and then reported to Fresh Kills, where he ran one of the sifting operations. After retiring from the NYPD, he served overseas as an advisor with the U.S. Marine Corps and as senior counselor to DHS Secretary and current 9/11 Memorial and Museum board member Jay Johnson. Roger is currently the Director of Preparedness, Intelligence, and Inspections at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Martin Bellew managed the transportation of all World Trade Center debris from Ground Zero and helped oversee the Department of Sanitation's efforts at Fresh Kills. After retiring from DSNY in 2005, he worked in several engineering firms and is currently the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Control and the president of the Islip Resource Recovery Agency for the town of Islip. Please join me in welcoming them in conversation with Museum Director Clifford Chanin.
Thank you very much, Terry, and welcome to everybody here, our members, familiar faces, new faces. Just before we start, we talk about many aspects of 9/11 and its aftermath in our programs, whether those are programs for public audiences, for student audiences, or for special audiences like police recruits or fire recruits or FBI trainees. And so Fresh Kills is really, and always has been, an example for us of how this enormous event, which is with its enormous consequences that essentially overwhelmed all the systems that were in place for normal emergencies, how this event created this remarkable improvised response. And Fresh Kills, as I say, is a great example of this. But, as we talk about it, and even we who talk about it often, we take a lot for granted about that. As if it were just a normal, natural course of business to have to deal with, all of these tons of building elements and such from the World Trade Center and sift them and go through them as that normal course of business. And so tonight, I hope we can really dig into how this actually happened, because we can't forget that when 9/11 occurred, this was a closed landfill, essentially an empty field in Staten Island. And what turned out to be needed was the creation of, as I've called it before, essentially a factory for the processing of this material to find human remains and other things that would be needed. And how you do that from a standing start with no preparation and no training is one of the most remarkable stories that I know in terms of what 9/11 was and what it required of those who served in all kinds of capacities in those days. And these gentlemen are here to tell us a little bit about it. So I want to start by, for each of you, and briefly if you would, just, who were you on September 11th, 2001? What were you doing? And what got you to Fresh Kills? And let me start with Richard Marx, who was the co-incident commander for the FBI at that scene in Fresh Kills.
So when September 11th happened, I was stationed in Philadelphia as a regular field agent, and I was deployed, obviously, to help come into New York. And at that time, I thought I was going to go to Camp David. There was all kinds of different places that they were talking on the news at the time, and until it was finalized, that was Shanksville, Pentagon, and New York. So I got sent to New York on that evening, the 11th, and then reported to temporary headquarters in Newark, and that's where I came up. So at the time, I was 29 years old. I'd been in the Bureau. Well, I take that back. I was in my 30s at that time, but I was 29 when I came in the Bureau, and I'd been in the Bureau 4.5 years. So I was in my early 30s, and I'd had previous large scene experience with the embassy bombings in Nairobi in 98, and the Egypt Air crash off Narragansett, Rhode Island in 99. So I'd had some experience, but nothing like what we were all just talking about. And so, we bring those little snippets of what we'd done in the past to those scenes here, and then being thrust into working with the New York City Police Department, which was a first for me. But, I'd learned coming from a state crime lab how to work with anybody. And so that was our thought processes during this time was, I knew the relationship at the time between the Bureau and the PD was a little tough, but I wasn't going to be that person that caused it to be worse. So it got better. And, I got to be fast friends with Jimmy Luongo, who's not here tonight, but he was my co-incident commander. And it was just an easy reach with these guys because we were all focused on the same mission.
Roger, you're the PD side of that equation. How did you come to involvement with Fresh Kills?
So I get involved with Fresh Kills by the fact that they were looking for detectives and detective squad commanders to work the different operations within Fresh Kills. So I wasn't involved in the setup. I actually, as mentioned before, I responded on September 11th before the towers came down. They also wanted detectives for the victim centers. And I knew myself that I couldn't work the victim centers. So I volunteered to do Fresh Kills when they needed somebody to fill a spot. And it was, to be honest with you, for me, it was a kind of therapy because it was a positive to help find remains or some identifying remarks to help give some closure for the family. So it was one of the more positive experiences I had related to September 11th that helped me get through.
Now, Marty, you were already senior in the Department of Sanitation, and I've read moral history that you did. You guys kind of assumed right away that this was going to be your job. I'm not sure if you realized the scale of it, but talk to me about that morning, what you're watching happen, and how it clicked in that you guys were going to be the ones to do this.
Yeah,
I was at the time Deputy Director of Waste Disposal and Waste Disposal Engineering, and I was at a meeting with the first Deputy Commissioner that day. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning, sunny, and we heard an explosion, and then we saw on TV what had happened, and then we actually, from the building, because I was close by the Trade Center, we saw the second plane go into the other tower. We happened to be looking at the same time, and we didn't start planning at that point, but then once they started collapsing, we knew we would be called into service. And that's when, we met with, the commissioner and the first deputy commissioner, the commissioner, and the deputy mayor, Joe Loader, and Mayor Giuliani to talk about what would occur. And, one of the issues was, I was responsible to close the landfill in the first place. So in 1996, when Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki announced the closure, they wanted it closed by December of 2001. So I did all of the planning and to move all the waste and export it out of the city. So, we knew that the landfill actually, because there was talks about other facilities that would be used, but any facility that they could find were very, very small. So you would end up having to split the material all across the city in different spots. So we had a site out there that was relatively flat because we were still in the closure mode. So it was kind of, it was accommodating for the material that we needed to do. And to move the material, that's the job we've done for many, many years.
Even though at a much greater scale this would be. Now, I want to show.
Well, no, look at most years when I worked at Fresh Kills, we were doing, some years in the peak was 6 to 8 million tons a year.
Yeah. I came across this photo shared by my colleagues. I'd never seen it before. So if you can bring up photo number 5, this gives you a sense. This is an early photo that was taken at the site. It'll be up here in a minute. And it just shows you sort of the scale of this and how really there was nothing there. And so, Richard, let me come back to you because you haven't really given us the detail as to when someone, whoever it was, said to you, go out there and make sense of this. So how did that happen? Did you know what to do, or how did you figure any of this out?
In the Bureau, when we have a large-scale scene, like to say for the embassy bombings, you're limited by what's around you sometimes equipment-wise. You're in a third world country. You don't have quite the resource you had. Suddenly now we're here. We've got the massive resources of the Department of Sanitation. I mean, nowhere else in the United States could you have done this except for New York City, probably to this level of degree because we had such massive pieces of equipment. And so when I showed up there, the first folks I think I met were some uniformed guys from Staten Island, eventually replaced by the Detective Bureau with Jimmy coming out. We had this large debris field. We were trying to figure it out. And in the past, what we would do, like at the embassy bombings, you would take a front end loader, you would scoop up debris, and you would start shaking it out as the machine's backing up so it wouldn't run over it. You sprinkle it out in a field. The agents or the officers would walk through and you'd scour the material. So that we kind of had that experience before, but this is something way beyond the amount of debris we had at the embassy bombings. Or anything else that we'd had up to that time. So we had to come up with a better way to do it. And one of the things that we were very mindful of in the beginning is that the families are going to be our biggest critics. So if you don't give it the right look, if you don't bring and do your best effort and give them transparency on it, they're not going to be happy. And then we have to answer to them because, I would want them looking for something as hard as it would be for one of my family members. And so this process was one that constantly evolved. You see this on what was laid out here. That's not what it ended up being. We were intense. We had no power substation. We eventually had Con Ed come up and put up a whole substation, run 100 phone lines. Verizon and the phone companies brought up 100 phone lines. So it was really amazing the amount of work that went into making this a functioning site because we knew we were going to be there longer. At the initial planning, this lasted 11 months. We thought we'd be there 2 years on this thing because of the amount of debris coming out of ground zero. how we were bringing it up there. Rough calculation, we thought 2 years. And it really got to be where we were running, planning this operation out. We said, we've got a plan for the winter that's coming. Well, we were already down the road, the PD and the sanitation, setting up these sifting machines that were used normally for demolition work, was working perfectly. So we started having this plan of evolving, moving from this sprinkling out debris, spreading it out with the grapplers like you see down in the museum below. You see a grappler hook with a rebar. So we started a plan of how to move this material around and lay out a functioning site that would give us areas to work in and all kinds of climate, have the lighting so that they could work 24/7 if they needed to. Because if the workers are, I know this goes against a lot of belief, if the workers are protected, satisfied, fed, they understand the mission, they're focused, they're much more content and will look as hard as they can. I mean, obviously in this thing, everybody's looking as hard as they could, but try to sustain that for months. And that's where sometimes these efforts fall off over time. And the PD and everybody was committed to the cause. And that was what really made this work, because we all worked together to make this a working solution up there.
So, Roger, I think it's interesting to note that it was the chief of detectives, William Alley, who was given sort of the overall command of this in relation to the PD. And that, as I assume, why detectives were brought in. But that also underscores the point that this is a crime scene or a criminal investigation. And I assume that will raise the importance of having detectives doing this, because it is their job to do these investigations of crimes. And so most of you had great experience as police officers already, and treating this as a crime scene, obviously at a scale, again, that nobody really would have imagined.
Yeah, so you bring up Chief Ali Chuffin. He passed away from a 9/11 illness.
That's right. We'll talk about
5
that.
years ago. 5 years ago this month.
We'll talk about that in a moment.
Originally, I think their originally thought process was the squad detectives that were used to crime scenes, and then eventually all detectives were brought in, even public morals, vice, gambling, to help. But it was the recognizing the monotony of looking through something, trying to find something, first something personal, something or some evidence, or human remains. It's basically the three things you concentrate on.
So I want to come to that and ask each of you. Obviously, the mission at the first phase was human remains. There were, to this day, there still are, more than 1,000 people who died here in New York who have not shown any trace of themselves in any of these materials recovered. But as we heard in the introduction, there were human remains recovered and identified for families. How did, for each of you, that reality sort of define what the mission was and how you went about doing it? Marty, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, our first mission, above everything, was rescue. So we, I was down at Ground Zero, I was at Fresh Kills and all. That day was to get the equipment there so that the fire department could perform rescue, of anybody that they could. So that was the priority. And then, later it moved as once we started moving material, I mean, we delivered the first load to the Marine transfer stations at 11 p.m. Fresh Kills, it showed up at about 2 a.m. So we moved a lot of equipment and, to help the fire department for the rescue. And then once it was out of Fresh Kills, it was really the job of the FBI and the police, that did the screening and the searching. We worked with a firm called Phillips and Jordan from the Army Corps. And, we set up a health and safety plan through Evans Environmental. I'm a chemical engineer, so I work closely with that. And, as Rich mentioned, we were worried about the winter, going into the winter. This was September already. And as it turned out, it was the mildest winter we've ever seen in New York. But they were charged with the responsibility of making sure the screening was, but we had all of the equipment there from Phillips and Jordan to, 1/4 inch minus. Mm-hmm. That's what we took.
So to be able to find something to a 1/4 of inch.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you had anthropologists out there and, to check, because there was probably in the order of 15, 20 restaurants in the area. So, you still had food, lying around in those restaurants, to make sure that anything you found were not, was human, actually.
Right, right. Roger, I mean, that must have been sort of a defining element for the police detectives who were out there. You mentioned before in terms of your sense of mission, of being able to do something for the families who had been left with nothing. But still, that's a burden on a daily basis to sort of face that.
I remember the detectives being very motivated, and I feel as though that they were probably in the same place I was, where they thought that this was a real positive thing that they could do, and they actually enjoyed what they were doing. When you found a personal effect, even like an ID card or a photograph, you had instant gratification. The human remains, you didn't, because, as was mentioned, the 20 restaurants, so you'd get something that you'd swear was human, and then you take it over to the tent, and it wasn't necessarily. So you almost were disappointed that you couldn't help somebody out.
Yeah, yeah. Just in relation to that recovered property, we heard the numbers. I mean, tens of thousands of objects were both recovered, and 85 or 87% of them were ultimately returned to survivors or to families who'd lost someone. I mean, it's just, again, the scale of it and the commitment that it demonstrates to do something at that scale again and again repeats itself in this story.
Yes.
Richard, again, this issue of what you're really looking for is some way of restoring something that, in fact, has been lost by the families, but something at least to hold on to.
It's when you go into it, you don't sit there and think, oh, we're going to have 1,000 people missing to 20 years later. That's not something that we all think about in these things. When you go in, everybody up there, all of us from police to sanitation, we all knew somebody there during that time period, or were one person removed from those people, and we all thought we were going to find them. That's why so many people were committed to it, was actually finding a little bit. And having our past experiences, at least mine with plane crashes, you can go into a plane crash and a small piece of tissue might be all that you find of that person that verifies that they are there, that they were at that place, and that's all it takes. So when we were sifting this stuff down to a 1/4 size, I remember I carried a marble around in my pocket for a long time and showed it to people when the family members would come and say, this is the level of stuff that we're screening out, in hopes of showing them the attention to detail that we were going to find their loved ones. Because that's why we let them come up. As police officers, we normally try to shield family members from seeing things that they shouldn't have to see. That's our job. In this case, we wanted to have that transparency so they could see the care that everybody was going through. And our biggest fears were that they would see something coming off the belt that they shouldn't see. And in one instance, it did happen. But the family, God bless them, they took it in stride, and they understood the care that was given to that remains coming off the belt. And as I said to somebody earlier in the museum, when we find the personal effects, like you're talking about giving something back to a family, think about that as you sit in this room. What would you want from your parents or your wife or your kid? What's the most important thing that you would want if they left the house today? Because most of your stuff's at home, right? And in this instance, as we can all attest to, the building pulverized everything that was inside. The only things that I remember surviving were casters off the chairs, computer chipboards from computers. There was no phones, everything was pulverized. And so when you're looking for these things, the resilient things were the credit cards everywhere. They seem to outlast driver's license. But what would you want back? And I've had the opportunity to ask myself, my parents, would I want their wedding rings? Would I want my mom's jewelry? Is it just the last thing they held? And sometimes when you see there's some of the artifacts of the IDs that they had on them, that's the last thing that was with them at that time. So it holds so much value to a family member that you really can't put any type of a value to it other than what they put to it. So that's why we're committed to finding those things. For instance, like at the Vegas shooting, you have 14,000 chairs. What's the most important chair? It's the one that Uncle Mike sat in and watched every Buffalo Bills football game till the end of time. And so the same thing with the World Trade Center. What is the most important thing? It's whatever that person values. It could be something from a set of keys to their wallet to their purse to maybe a shoe. That's all you find. So that's part of what we were doing out there. Once it became apparent that this was bigger than just finding human remains, the personal effects part of it was a big aspect of it.
Marty, talk to us about the scale of this operation, because the sanitation pickups all across the city continued. So all of that personnel and equipment still needed to go about the tasks of normal life. And yet you had this enormous, essentially 24-hour operation going of bringing this material from the site of this mass tragedy, historic event, out to Staten Island.
Well, I mean, we closed Fresh Kills early that year, ahead of schedule. So just so you know, there's 17 operating unions that work at Fresh Kills. Okay, it's not just one title. You have oilers, blacksmiths, crane engineers, tractor operators. So we have a conglomerate. I mean, because we closed early, a lot of those people we were waiting, we didn't really let them go. So they were still present doing work, miscellaneous work, until we could figure out, how we could, reassign them maybe in another agency or things like that. So the trade titles we had available. The sanitation workers, they went back to the Bureau of Cleaning and Collection. So I asked for volunteers immediately that day, and we opened the facilities that evening. They all came back. They all said, no problem, they'll be right there. So, that's how, Fresh Kills then was back in operation, and we had barges, we had the cranes, we had everything. And, we set up temporary marine transfer stations down by Stuyvesant High School, and, we dredged there before we did it, to get the draft for the boats and all. And then we started moving the boats out of there besides the marine transfer stations, because we didn't want the trucks traveling through the city. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of confined under Canal Street after a short period of time that no trucks really left. The rest of the city, we operated as usual, and like I said in the movie, I mean, we're measured by our failures, and there was no failures. And nobody complained that their garbage was out on the curb and not picked up. So, it was, those are things that we do each and every day. And, if somebody really looked at it, like, where does your refuse really go? It could be South Carolina, or it could be Ohio, or it could be anywhere. It's, I don't think the general public really understands how monumental it is to move waste through the city, especially New York.
Yeah. You mentioned something in Rogers Well, which is a really interesting point, and I've heard this from other people who are involved out at Fresh Kills. Not only, and I'm going to ask you each to comment on this, but people in the various services were willing or anxious to be part of this. People wanted to do something to help. So it doesn't seem like there were a lot of people who were, turning down assignments like this. To the contrary, from what I understand, there were volunteers, there were people who were retired who came back to help and such, because again, in the aftermath of 9/11, people were looking for a way to be helpful and a way to contribute in one way or another. But, it does speak to the kind of spirit animating these kinds of efforts. And I wonder if you could each talk about that. Maybe, there's a story in your mind about someone going the extra yard because of what they were dealing with out at Fresh Kills. Let me start with you, Richard.
Well, you have to remember, the total number of people we had rotated through Fresh Kills was about 24,000 people that rotated through there in an 11-month period. And that alone, I mean, we probably had about 30 state and federal agencies up there, all playing nice. And I know that doesn't make for a good Sunday night movie, obviously, where people are at each other's throats, but that camaraderie that permeated that workload out there, people were willing to go the extra bit to show up. There was none, like you said, nobody complained about trash pickup. Nobody complained about working an extra hour beyond their shift, because that's what we were expected to do during that type of event. And so when people were up there, I mean, you would have the National Guard. The first few days we were living out of National Guard tents. The ground was bubbling from methane because the rain was coming down. And literally, you'd walk through the fields out there, and it was like walking through a consistency of a shake. And the ground was literally bubbling, like with methane bubbles coming out there. It was like you being in some other world. And people were bringing food from their kitchens on Staten Island, dropping food off at the gate, just for the workers, because you can't break, when you got 1,000 people a day working, nobody breaks for lunch and something like that. You have to eat there and work there because it just takes so long for people to get off the site. Plus you had environmental issues with the PPE, the protective equipment that we were wearing, respirators. You can't walk off site like that. So for us, it was immensely, the community was such a part of it. Whether they were the little old lady that was standing down at the base waving her flag every day by herself when we came in, or people bringing food up, it was all there. And so people constantly went above and beyond out there, and it was it showed in everybody that was up there. There was not a person that was disgruntled. There was not a person that didn't want to. If you're working in the worst environment, people wanted to be there to help because they all knew somebody. They all knew a cop that disappeared. They knew an agent that died, or they knew just somebody that went to work that day that died. And so there was all kinds of stories of that, of people going that extra degree to help somebody up there.
Roger, your recollection of that kind of devotion?
So I remember the Salvation Army being there and feeding us and asking us if we were okay. I recall somebody was giving massages. I just remember that you felt supported. You felt like you were doing something proper. The comment about 30 city, state, federal agencies. I spoke to Jimmy Luongo today on the phone. I said, if there's one thing you want me to mention while I'm here, what would you like me to say? And to follow up, he said, it was amazing how everyone got together and there was no real egos. Everybody understood the mission and were able to work through issues to get things done.
Marty, on your end with sanitation?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to describe the testament of the employees in this case was City Hall wanted to show the world that New York wasn't affected. So one of the tasks they gave us was that they wanted to open the stock market the following Monday, the 17th. And in order to get that done, it's a tremendous amount of cleaning. You could imagine the whole area down here. But it was accomplished, and the stock market was opened on Monday the 17th.
Yeah, one thing after another. You mentioned the families before, and it was not uncontroversial with some family members that this closed landfill was used. You've explained that there was really no other place to take this amount of material. But, ultimately there were lawsuits involved in, keeping these sifted materials at the site. You mentioned, Richard, before talking about these relationships with families, but I want to hone in on that a little bit because, again, you've all talked about this being central to the mission, that the recovery of whatever could be found was really what you were there for. Particular stories that come to mind about family members? You mentioned one, Richard, but I'll go back to you again.
When you have this type of, like I said, nobody envisioned at the beginning that we would still be missing these folks. And so the family members would come up probably every week, about 60 at a time. And they would, we would give them complete access because, again, that's what as a family member you would want, right? You'd want to see what's going on. You'd want to see what is being done to find your loved one. You don't want to see people sitting around doing nothing. You want to see what's actually being done up there. And so it was kind of closed off from the public. There wasn't a public, you're on top of a hill. You're surrounded by a fence. The water's on one side around there. So it's not like cameras were focused on us like they were at Ground Zero. So, people were wanting to see what's up there. When the family came up there, we gave them access. And, they would walk around. They would see things. They would ask questions. And so when we would find those little bits and pieces, they might want to take a little dirt. If that was the family member, if they wanted to take the dirt back with them, that we would let them take the dirt with them because they were all just trying to see what was going on up there and asked all the questions of us and determine what type of operation we had going up there. And so part of it was to be able to let them see that as they came through and give them those answers they needed.
Roger?
I didn't deal with any family members. I wasn't emotionally equipped to deal with family members. I purposely stayed away from that, so I don't have any comments as it relates to them.
Marty?
Yeah, one of the things is, we had the cars from Ground Zero. So some of them were towed, some of them were driven. And one of the tasks that we had was to, locate the owner and have them come and take the personal belongings out of the car, you know. And we had a lady one day that her husband, who survived the '93 bombing, did not make it through this terrorist attack, and her birthday present was in the trunk.
We also have the issue of the health impacts on not just at Fresh Kills, but of thousands of people who, whether at Ground Zero in the surrounding areas, residents of the neighborhoods, out at Fresh Kills, at the Pentagon site. I mean, we're still seeing tens of thousands of cases that in some cases have, in many cases, have led to death. I do want to mention that, you know, each of the three agencies represented here has lost substantial numbers of their members. You know, the FBI has 18 on its wall of honor. Sanitation counts 115 members, and PD counts more than 300. And I highlight the PD number for a minute because, you know, there were 23 members of the NYPD who died in service on 9/11, and the number of 9/11 related deaths since 9/11 is 12 or 15 times the number who died on the day. And so, again, you know, it's very easy to focus on the service of the day, which was heroic and important and extraordinary. But this longer term impact of these kinds of efforts out at Fresh Kills and elsewhere have also exacted, you know, a terrible toll that continues to increase day after day. But, you know, I know that you were very aware of PPP and these kinds of things, but, you know, the environment was what it was, and the materials you were dealing with had these toxicities in them. How aware were you of that as you're dealing with it? And in retrospect, you know, how do you look at that problem today?
I think, you know, when you look back on how a lot of us in the 93 bombing as compared to now, we were light years on 9/11 away from 93 because we learned so much. I remember in my first scenes with the Bureau at the Nairobi bombings, we deployed, we didn't have Tyvek, the white uniforms that you see all of us wearing. We didn't have, you know, the proper respirators. We had to borrow them from other agencies. So it's changed immensely. And I think out there, we really gave it the best shot we could with a health and safety plan because the hardest part is seeing somebody working with a respirator and it's hanging around their neck. Respirators are not comfortable to work in for long periods of time. We really tried out there at Fresh Kills because, look, you take a building, you take 200-story buildings, you burn everything that's in them. Think about it, the mercury lights in the ceiling, the carpet, the chemicals in the carpet, the melamine, the wood, everything that's in there is going to produce something bad and nasty and toxic. Firefighters have known it for years. They've been wearing those full-face respirators with the air breathers on them for years. So when you have something like that, let alone the particulate matter of asbestos, right? We were wearing asbestos air monitors out there, and we're getting exposed to 4 times the legal limit for asbestos out there. So we knew it was a problem. The health and safety plan that we talked about with sanitation, all of that was implemented fairly early on. We had guys that were kind of like referees that were wearing the vest, the orange visible vest, that if they caught you on the field and you weren't wearing your respirator, they would kick you off the field. And so we really think we had a fairly good plan. Was it going to be stop everything? No, because again, what chemicals were out there? In hindsight, you couldn't tell. We were focused on the mission, sifting, but we weren't like at Ground Zero where you were in a kind of a concentrated area. We're on top of a landfill. The breeze is always blowing up there, but it was still an issue that we felt was important enough to make people wear their hard hats, their gloves, their glasses, and all that time up there, the only incident we had was a guy broke his hand when an I-beam fell on it. That was the only really traumatic injury. Now, years later, we've had people develop health issues, and it's an unfortunate thing because nobody was prepared. Now it's kind of a regular staple at these scenes when you're dealing with hazardous materials that you take the utmost precaution. But at the time, we did the best plan we thought possible. And Ground Zero was, I can't speak of it because I wasn't really down at Ground Zero, but you can see now the issues that all of our agencies are suffering from this with the health issues that are coming out of it. And I don't think any of us standing here 20 years from our former selves thought it would be something like this bad. We knew that there was bad stuff in there. Not, you know, kind of like at home when you're dealing with like bleach or something, you put your gloves on, right? Because you know you're dealing with nasty stuff. Same thing, we knew we were dealing with nasty stuff. Sanitation's been working with this stuff for years. And I don't think any of us really understood until that day and the aftermath of what was going to come from it.
Roger, your sense of all that out there?
I recall it was pretty top notch because I was on the first 10 days on the pile, and we didn't have much supplies, and you had small amounts of supplies. But by the time I got to Fresh Kills, you would be given boots, Tyvek suits. You would go work. You had the respirator. You had the referees, which brought back funny memories of getting yelled at. But then you would, if you wanted to take a break and get something to eat, all that came off again. You got decontaminated, went and got something to eat, then got redressed and went back out. I thought it was an eye opener for me, how much concern and how much thought went into it when it was not something I was used to working with.
Yeah. Marty, you mentioned before that you wanted not to take this material on trucks through city streets, and there were risks involved with taking it over the water in barges, but it did minimize certain exposures for large numbers of people. So you all must have been aware of the possibilities of handling and treating this material.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I was at both locations, Ground Zero and Fresh Kills. You know, I was on the pile the day of and all of that. But, you know, they're two different, you know, sites. I mean, we were fortunate out there that, you know, we could create exclusion zones and have proper PPE, you know, in areas. Is it fail-safe? Probably not, but it was there. I mean, you mentioned, and, you know, it's unfortunate, 115 individuals from sanitation passed away, of which I personally know, I looked the other day, I know 53 of them. And out of that 53, about 25 of them were from Fresh Kills. And but one of the things with Fresh Kills is, you know, we had approximately 200 workers there that were there every day. You know, like Rich said, you know, there's 25,000 people came in, you know, in and out, but sanitation, we were there every day. Rich was there every day. I mean, there are certain individuals, but we were there every day, the sanitation personnel.
Yeah.
One of the things that, and when you talk about the trucks, it brings back memories. You guys remember this, but the initial delivery process was the trucks coming out there. But you think of your fireplace at home, when the fireplace burns down, you got embers underneath, and as you kick them up, it starts again. We had several trucks going down the interstate. As the wind would hit them, it would reignite the trucks. And just like you're blowing on your fire at home to get the coals kicking up the trucks. And that's eventually kind of what directed us to, again, a system that nobody else really has. This barge system was really allowed us to move larger amounts of material from Ground Zero out to Fresh Kills over a fairly safe area. Well, I mean, the water was away from everybody else, and we didn't have to worry about things catching on fire out there on the barges.
Yeah, and I wrote the permits with myself and Richie Shearer, God rest his soul, the commissioner of OEM, you know, to operate those areas, you know, and we submitted it to the state, and I believe they gave us an approval, but, you know, I never really followed up on it. But the permit was issued, you know, like it was given to them, and I was happy we delivered it, you know.
Well, we won't tell on you. Let's see if we can get a question or two from the audience here. Let's see, and wait for a microphone. Raise your hand. Right up front, right up front. Hang on.
What always just
You're on.
what always struck me the most about a site like the Ground Zero was the smell, and obviously a sanitation dump, irrespective of this kind of thing, would always have some kinds of smells. But was there anything in the product that was brought over and sifted that had anything similar to the? I always used to call it the smell of death. It was very, very, very particular. And I'm wondering if that was something that affected the site in the Fresh Kills.
I would say that the fresh kills, the smell from the debris was always a very acrid type of smell, like a very distinctive smell. I'm surprised I didn't smell it when I walked in the museum today. It's probably been so much time that either I've lost my sense of smell but it had a very distinctive smell. But you talk of the smell of death, and for a while there, we had a lot of canines coming up through that. As you remember, you probably saw them on the debris pile. The canines would come and they were looking for survivors. They're trained to find people in there. And the handlers at the time told us towards the end, eventually we phased them out going towards more of a mechanized search, but the dogs were suffering from a depression almost. That's what the handlers would tell us, because they're trained to find people in or deceased individuals in a debris field. And the smell was everywhere. So the dogs were having a hard time targeting the areas to find things because it was all intermingled amongst all the debris. We didn't so much smell it up there because, again, it was just all of the debris had a distinctive smell of the ground zero, the burning and the kind of like I said, an acrid smell, but it just wasn't a smell of complete death. But the dogs definitely sensed it. Dogs obviously having a different smeller than the rest of us, but they sensed it. And again, the handlers told us that many times the dogs were having depression because they weren't finding the person hiding amongst the bushes like they normally do when they're trained to find somebody.
Yeah, I mean, you have, for lack of a better description, I mean, it was more what we would call a construction and demolition material, okay, as opposed to organics. So, if you look at a municipal, solid waste landfill, the smells are totally different from both. But the smells out there were even more different than that.
Yeah, I think these here had that different smell, the acidic smell that you can still smell if you get near any kind of dust that's involved. That at the landfill, I think that methane played a heavy role. If you were enclosed in a tent, you had to go out and get some air every once in a while, otherwise you started getting headaches.
Yeah, that's something you think about. All the structures that were built there on top of Fresh Kills, whether it be we built these tents that would cover the large working fields like the size of a football field to give people, we had two of them, that people could work inside that were open on both ends that, didn't allow the rain on it or the snow. That's what we were planning for. And then we had the belt screeners, which also had screens over them that had heaters inside it and lights so that the people could be comfortable to keep them working during the cold and the winter that didn't come, like you said, the mildest winter that we ever had out there. So one of the things you have to think about is all that methane that we talked about that was bubbling up would come up, and we actually had to put methane monitors in the buildings where we outfitted folks for the safety gear, whether they got fitted for the respirators or they got it fitted for their white Tyvek suits, because you didn't want somebody to light a match in there and cook off an entire building, right? Those are the kinds of things that we'd never seen before. This is the first time I've done several landfill searches since then, but I've never done anything like this where you're building on top of a structure that, and these guys were fabulous as far as sanitation, as far as the engineering that went into it, how the methane stations worked, how, you're pressing down on top of something that's built like a layer cake with years and decades worth of trash underneath, but it's all engineered in a specific way for the landfill to reclaim all that methane. And so it was a real education for me, but these guys were top notch in knowing what they're doing. And so it took in a lot of considerations of things that I've never had to deal with since then, as far as building structures on top of landfills. So it's really something that, it's really when we talk about what these folks from the PD and the sanitation did and all of us did, you built a city that doesn't exist anymore. Well, we have nothing really to show other than what we've given back to the victims' families out of this thing at the end of the day. And that's really, it was a massive city where thousands of people worked for 11 months. And at the end of it, it's been reclaimed by nature and it's been smoothed over by Department of Sanitation. And it's a different kind of
It's
place.
now being converted into parkland, actually, 2,200 acres.
Right.
I think earlier this year this was announced. And Marty, I don't know if you know the latest on it, but
Well, I let the competition out for that years ago to build a park there. And, one of the reasons, you have to do sections at a time. Like only, I believe, July of 2022, they finally capped and closed section 1 and 9, which is where the trade center was placed. So,
and that will be marked off separately with a special.
well, then it's 30 years from that you do monitor.
Yeah.
And then, you have limited use. You might have some, walking paths, bicycle paths, things like that, but you can't, penetrate the cap or anything like that.
Other question? Up front here. Oh. Sorry.
What was it like after, I assume, having been in it so intensely for so long, like what was it like to realize that you were done and go back to your regular job and regular life?
The operation shut down on August 9th, 2002. That was our last. I mean, we still had stuff to take down, but that was when the last debris passed through the belts. And look, we spent time power washing all the barges down, scooping everything out, making sure that and even skimming off the top layer of the cap of the old landfill so that we could say that if something fell off a truck or got stuck somewhere, that at least we gave it the best look. I mean, those barges were the cleanest they've ever been because we power washed them down at the end. I mean, literally, and then we vacuumed all of it out and ran it through out there. But when we were done, it was very surreal because it had become a band. I hate to use the term, but it was like a band of brothers because we all of us that were there, whether it be at Ground Zero or there, we go right back to when we talk about it. It's like it's still fresh in the memories. And so when it was over, suddenly it's like quitting a job on a Monday and not seeing everybody again for years. And so a lot of people went the way of the wind. A lot of people retired. And so when I went back to work, catching bank robbers in Philadelphia, but it was weird because we had dealt with adrenaline for 11 months. Making decisions, hundreds of decisions, and I found myself at home organizing magazines in chronological order because, you were so busy of answering people's questions and being on because you have to be engaging when people ask you questions. Family members say, "Hey, what are you doing today?" You have to answer their questions, and so suddenly you're removed from all of that. The adrenaline's gone, and having worked a lot of these scenes over the years, I see it now more so, and I'm sure all of you guys had the same experience when it was all over with. It's a different focus. You had to switch gears.
Marty?
Yeah, I mean, the co-worker with Rich, Jimmy Luongo, it was like old home week when I met him down at the ball drop at Times Square a couple of years back, and we traded a few stories, but we were busy doing our regular thing, like in the city, just picking up the refuse and moving it out and get ready for the long-term plan. That was the next level of effort.
Roger, let me ask you, but also the question I'll ask each of you is, as we close this, what have you taken away from your experience there over the years, and where has it found its way into your life, and what you remember and most important about all of that?
Well, it's just one of the aspects of the 9/11 experience for me, but it was without question the most rewarding of it. And tonight, to hear some of the numbers, to say, sorry, those numbers of like 700 people getting identified. I've heard between 600 and 800 eventually getting identified. Personal effects. That it worked. What these two gentlemen and Jimmy Luongo set out to do happened.
Yeah. Marty, you.
Yeah, I mean, I went through a traumatic experience before it. My wife passed away, and I had two small children. But one of the things I stayed positive was to look around at all the workers that I saw every day, whether it was Ground Zero or the Kills or anywhere, and just realize the strength and resiliency of the workers, to get this job done. And that was the positive attitude I tried to keep throughout the whole, active work.
Richard, this has essentially, you were a young FBI agent at that point. I mean,
Yes.
yes.
I don't mean
I don't mean
bit since then.
I don't mean to rub it in, but this has defined your career. You have now become one of the Bureau's specialists in this kind of recovery operation after terrible tragedy.
Yeah, when 9/11 happened and it was over, I felt like I had something to give back to my agency, especially because we'd had a lot of big scenes over the years, and I still wanted to kind of do that because before I came to the Bureau, I remember seeing Oklahoma City and like, wow, how do you do that? That's so. And then this, now thank goodness we haven't had anything similar to it, but I've found myself doing this over my career, whether it be, I worked the Pulse nightclub. I was in charge of that. The Vegas shooting. My last one was Buffalo. This is what I do, and I've carried on what I've learned here with the family members. I've tried to do that at every scene that I go to because I think it's a valuable thing that we, again, I don't know, somewhere in the news we get bad press all the time, but the reality is that, we're very committed to that kind of stuff, and I'm very committed to it because that's what I've been doing with my life for the last 20 years, and I feel passionate about it, whether it be, working over in Ukraine, MH17, I was a part of that, So this is what I do. This is what I chose to do with my career and build on what I've learned with these fine gentlemen, working with the PD, can't say enough for those guys. It's been a very rewarding career, and I'm glad that it drove me in the direction of helping give closure to so many people out there if I can do that. Sometimes you can't, but I can at least say we've tried and tried to do the best we can.
Well, I think you'll agree that I was right. There's a lot to this story that when you actually break it down, it just gets deeper, more interesting, and more remarkable in terms of what it demanded and what it received from these three gentlemen and thousands of others who are out there. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking Roger Parrino, Marty Bellew, Richard Marx.